Here are my top 10 ESL games and activities for adults. Number one is the small talk game. So with the small talk game, I make a grid of 5 by 5 and then I put a bunch of small talk topics in it. So for example, weather, hobbies, sports, daily life, school, work, etc. Then I put students into pairs and each pair would partner up with another pair. So 4 people together, 2 teams of 2. They would get one grid. And then they do rock, scissors, paper, and the winner gets to choose one of the squares, and then the other team would be the timing team. So they would time 1 minute, and the 2 people that chose that square, for example, weather, would have to talk about the weather for 1 minute without stopping. If they complete their task, they can put a little X. That team is maybe the X, and the other team is the O, so they would put their little X over that square. And the goal is to get 3 squares in a row. So once they finish that, the game is over. All right, the second game is just a minute. So I would put a bunch of topics up on the board. So like maybe favorite food, what you do on the weekend, maybe like favorite sports or hobbies, just kind of things that people can talk about, that everybody would have something to say about it. Then I put students into groups of 4 and I would get students to number themselves off in each group. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So each group would have a number 1, each group would have a number 2. And then I would throw a little scrunched up paper ball at the board. If it hits weather, I would say, okay, number 1 in the group, you have to talk about weather for 1 minute. That's your challenge, to keep talking and to not stop. Then number 2, 3, and 4 in the group, they have to listen carefully. Then they have to ask a follow-up question at the end of the minute. And then I would erase that topic, and then I would choose a new topic, and then number 2 in each group has to talk for a minute and the same follow-up questions, and then continue for number 3 and 4. All right, the third game for adults is Get to Know You Bingo. So this is a really nice icebreaker activity. So have a standard bingo board, and then you could put kind of things on the board that you think some people might say yes to, but not everyone. So for example, loves pizza, is a third-year university student, hometown is Vancouver, I don't know, whatever the case might be that you think some people would say yes to, but not everybody would say yes to. Then students get a bingo board and they have to go around the class asking people a question. If someone says yes to a question, for example, do you love pizza? Yes, I do. Then they could write my name, Jackie, and then cross off that square. And just to kind of level up and make it a bit more interesting, I make students ask a follow-up question. So for example, if someone says, do you love pizza? Yes, I do. Then they could obviously say, what's your favorite kind of pizza? And I could say, oh, I love pineapple pizza, something like that. So the goal is to get one line. All right, the fourth game for adults is concentration. So this is ideal for teaching things like problem and advice, new vocabulary, maybe like questions and answers using the past tense, something like that. So I would make up a bunch of matching cards. So it could be like maybe the picture and then the vocabulary word, or like maybe the definition and the vocabulary word, or some problem, like I can't sleep at night, with some advice, you should drink tea before bed, something like that. And then I would cut them out, and usually I would have about 8 pairs, so about 16 is a nice number for this. And then I would put students into groups of 4, and they would take their papers and they would mix them up and they would place them face down in kind of a random fashion on the desk. The first person, they would take 2 papers and show everybody. So they'd keep them in the same spot. It's not a random guessing game, it's a memory game. So they would look and they maybe have like a picture of an apple, but then they have the word cucumber, something like that. So that's obviously not a match, so they put them face down, and then the next student goes. So they would find maybe the picture of the apple and the word apple, so that is a match. So they would take those 2 papers and they get 1 point and they get to go again. So continue until all of the cards are gone. All right, the fifth activity is running dictation. So this is a really fun 4 skills game that I like to play in all my ESL classes. So I use a conversation generally between 2 people that has lots of the target grammar or vocabulary. So I would make it sentence by sentence, and then I cut it out on individual slips of paper. And then before the students get to class, I would tape them at various points around the classroom. When students come to class, they would go together with a partner. So one person is the reader and the speaker, and the second person is the listener and the writer. So the reader would walk around the class and they would look at a piece of paper and they would memorize it, and then they would go back and tell the person who is the writer, and the writer writes it down. And then they would go to the next piece of paper, do the same thing, read it, remember it, and then go back and tell it to the other person who writes it down. And then when they're finished, I would say, okay, there's 8 pieces of paper, so you need 8 sentences. When they have all 8 sentences, they would give a number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they would make a coherent conversation. So the first team to make that conversation with a number of mistakes, I usually will allow like 1 or 2 mistakes in terms of spelling, something like that, they are the winner. The sixth thing you can do if you want to have some fun in your class is to use board games. So I really enjoy bringing board games into my class. So there's classics like Monopoly, which is quick and fun, but I also like playing Settlers of Catan, King of Tokyo, Puerto Rico, Seven Wonders. There's a whole bunch of really fun games. So my only requirement when I do this with students is that they have to be speaking in English to each other. And of course, I only bring English games with English instructions and English everything on them. To kind of make it an educational experience. But if you want to have a little fun party class, and this is especially fun if you teach classes of like say only 5 or 6 students, it's very easy to play like say a 6-player Settlers of Catan. All right, the next game for adults is 20 questions. So this is a classic I'm sure you played before. You think of a person, place, or thing, and then other people have 20 questions. They can ask you yes or no questions related to that. My rule is that a guess counts as one of the questions as well. So if, like, for example, someone narrows it down to an animal and then people start guessing cat, dog, tiger, fish, etc., it's not actually that fun. So those guesses also count as an answer. All right, the next ESL game for adults is charades and then also Pictionary. So charades is acting it out, Pictionary is drawing it. So this is a nice way to review some new vocabulary that you've been teaching, or these are also nice games for kind of like a holiday class, like a Christmas class, or if you want to do a Valentine's Day, something like that. And the final ESL game for adults is Apples to Apples. So this is where you put matching words together. So it's possible to design your own, but that's quite difficult. So I recommend buying the Apples to Apples online on Amazon or whatever. You can get a version for adults or a version for kids as well. And this is kind of a nice educational, fun, interesting game that adults like. Hi, this is Jackie from ESLspeaking.org. So here's a very simple ESL vocabulary activity that works well for any age, almost any level, and almost any topic that you have. It's called Most Words. So I choose a big long word that fits in with the theme of the day. So maybe I'm doing a Halloween lesson, so I could choose Halloween. Or maybe Christmas, I could use Christmas. You could also do it for a ton of other things. So for example, maybe you're talking about animals, you could do like elephant. Anything really works as long as it has a good number of letters to it. And then I put students into small groups and I write down the word on the board and they have to come up with as many words as possible out of that word. So for example, I'm doing this on the spot. I should have maybe planned ahead of time, but for example, maybe Christmas. So what are some words that you can make out of Christmas? Like has or chart. Is that right? Chart? Okay, perfect. So things like that. So I kind of make like a little code. So if students come up with like, say your word is 7 letters long and they can make another word that's 7 letters, I would give them maybe like 10 points. If it's 6 letters, I give them like 8 points and so on and so on. So I give each group maybe like 3 or 4 minutes and they can try to write down as many words as possible. And then, yeah, we can check answers just in kind of a fun way, just as a whole class together. Or you can make it into kind of like more of a competition and actually seriously check and then count up points and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's just kind of a very simple like warm up, time filler, kind of end of the class activity if you have a couple minutes, and yeah, check it out. So you know something that everyone likes doing is giving advice. Everyone knows how to solve other people's problems, right? So that's why I love to do this activity with my ESL or EFL students. It's called Agony Aunt. Agony Aunt, it's just an advice column that was in newspapers, I guess in Canada or the US. And people write in with their problems and then the Agony Aunt gives advice to these people and tries to solve their problems for them. So this is ideal for the unit in the textbooks that you can find, should and shouldn't, for giving advice. So the way it works is that I come up with a problem, something that's common kind of in the country that you're teaching and age appropriate as well. So I taught university students in Korea mostly. So my problem was there were these high school students or a high school student that was studying for it's called the Sunung exam. I guess it's kind of like the SAT that students would take in their grade 12 year. And it basically determines their entire future, their score, based on that, what university they'd get into. And it was kind of this like very big, serious, kind of like scary, stressful thing that students would spend their entire lives preparing for, basically. So anyway, it was a student in grade 12 preparing for this exam. And they were exhausted, they weren't sleeping, they weren't eating, they were losing a bunch of weight, and basically they were just in really rough shape. And they were so worried about their score on the test, their parents were hassling them to study more, and it was just a big mess. So I'd put students into groups, and then I'd give them something like probably 10 to 15 minutes, and I'd give them some time to write advice to this student. So what they would say to this person. And it was such a great one to do because all my students had been through that same process at some point in their lives, even recently as the previous year. So they all had good things to say to that student. So in groups, and then once that was done, they would read out their advice to the class. And then I would generally choose which advice I thought was best. And I mean, it was very subjective. So just kind of whatever advice was kind of some solid advice, and they did a good job using should and shouldn't, and yeah, they did quite a good job presenting it, that kind of thing. So I would just say like, oh, I really liked Team A over here, their advice was really great and you did a good job presenting, good work. But I would also say, oh, but from Team B, I liked this idea that you said, something like that. So yeah, just try out this activity, Agony Aunt, for when you're teaching about advice. Okay, so let's talk about two truths and a lie. It's a fun icebreaker for kind of any situation, but I use it specifically in my ESL or EFL classes. So the way it works is that I give students a couple minutes and they have to write down 3 statements. 2 of them are true and 1 of them is false. So the ones that I would use about myself are, I have a twin sister and my mom is a twin. The second one is, I have been to more than 50 countries. And the third one is, I've been bungee jumping 12 times. Which one do you think is a lie? I hope you guessed right. It is number 3. I've actually never been bungee jumping, but I do have a twin and my mom is a twin, all identical actually, which is kind of amazing. And I have been to a lot of countries as well. So anyway, I get students to do that. And then after that, I put them in small groups if we have a big class, or we do it all together if we have a smaller class. And then I get the other students in the group or the rest of the class to have about 2 or 3 minutes. I call it interrogation time. So they can ask questions to the person in the hot seat about their truths and their lie to try to uncover what it is. So for example, for me, students might ask, oh, what's your sister's name? Where did you go bungee jumping first? Or what's your favorite country? Or have you ever been to Africa? Any of those questions, they kind of quick rapid fire questions and then see what I struggle to answer. So then in the end, the other people in the group or the class, they vote on which one is the lie. So that's about it. One really fun way that I did is I was teaching a camp and I had the same group of students for the entire, I think it was 2 weeks, something like 6 hours a day, something like that. So I got 2 students to start off the class doing this activity, and it was kind of an icebreaker thing just to begin the class and kind of warm up everyone for using English. And then I got a student in the class, I called him the captain. Actually, the students appointed him as the captain. But so the person would go and they would say their 2 truths and a lie, we'd interrogate them. Everybody would vote on it, and then whoever was correct at uncovering the lie, they would get 1 point. And then the captain kept track of who had the most points throughout those couple weeks. And then at the end, I gave those couple people, the winners, I gave them a Starbucks gift card. And they loved it, actually. It was a really good activity, and we had a really fun time. And I said that they should be police men or police women, because they were obviously very good at understanding when people were lying. All right, so that's about it. That is one of my favorite ESL icebreakers. I'm going to talk about a very simple warm-up that you can use for writing classes. So I taught academic writing in Korean universities for many, many years, and this is what I did at the beginning of every single writing class that I did. It's called the 5-minute writing time. Students often get kind of laser focused or obsessed on accuracy, writing accuracy. So they want their grammar and their vocabulary choices to be perfect. However, that often comes at the expense of writing very slowly. So I did this quick activity to help them just write faster. So they would each have a notebook, and then I would have a topic of the day. So for example, like maybe a favorite memory from childhood, or talk about your family, talk about a movie that you watched recently, or what's your favorite TV show, or tell me about what you do on the weekend, something like that. So just kind of a general topic that everyone would have something to say about that. And then I would tell students to put away their phone and put away their dictionaries and just write. So I said that the goal was to keep your pen moving at all times. So they could start talking maybe about their hobby, and I like to play soccer. I usually plan weekends with my friends. I really like it because blah, blah, blah. And then if they ran out of things to say, I told students just to write, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write. And then eventually something will come to them and they will keep writing. So I said, if I look up, because I actually was writing at the same time. I would usually do the same topic as them. But I said, if I look up, I don't want to see anyone's pen not moving. I said, that is the goal of this activity. So they would do that in the notebook. And then at the end of the time, I would get students to count up how many words they had. So in the first class, I got them to count the exact number of words that they did. So maybe they did, say, 300 words, and they divide it by the number of lines. So they can kind of figure out their rough word count per line. So the first time it took quite a while, and then they would mark it in a chart. But all the other classes, they would just count up how many lines and kind of do like a rough guesstimate of how many words. So I said in their chart that they would map each day, I wanted to see it go up, up, up. So maybe they started out 300 words, they got, after a month it was 320, by the end of the semester maybe it was 400, something like that. So the goal was to increase their writing speed. So I didn't assign marks for this. Well, I did a little bit, so I would give them like five points or 5% of their final grade, but I would just quickly peruse their book, and I didn't actually read everything. I would just check their chart and just make sure that they were actually doing it in class instead of just sitting there on their cell phone or something like that. So yeah, it was 5 easy points for the students, and I think they really enjoyed it, just working on writing fluency. If you want to make idioms memorable, try this activity. The way it works is that I have a bunch of idioms, and they're often related to a theme, like for example, Christmas idioms or food idioms, sports idioms, something like that, whatever you're teaching your students. And then I make a list of the idioms, and students have to choose one of them. And then they have to draw a picture of the literal idiom. So for example, it's raining cats and dogs. They might have a person with an umbrella and little pictures of cats and dogs. And then after they draw their picture, I get them to make a few example sentences and then also to find out what it actually means in English. It's raining cats and dogs means it's raining a lot. So then after that, I get the students to just stand up very quickly and they show their picture to the class, and then everyone can kind of laugh because it's usually quite ridiculous actually if you draw these idioms literally. And then I get them to explain what it is in English and then to give their example sentences. Okay, so that's about it for this quick idiom activity. Hey everybody, this is Jackie from ESLspeaking.org. So I love 4Skills ESL activities. 4Skills activities combine reading, writing, listening, and speaking into a single activity. One of my favorites is running dictation. You can use it for just about any vocabulary set or grammar point. The students love it, and of course it's multi-skilled. All right, so I'll explain how it works with running dictation. So first of all, you need to find something, like a conversation between two people, maybe a poem, a short story that has some logical steps, maybe someone is cooking something. As long as you can divide it up into like the sentence level, sentence by sentence by sentence, and then it also should have a logical order in order for students to be able to do part 2. So let's do a conversation between two people. So maybe Bob and Tony. Cut out Bob's line, cut out Tony's line, Bob, Tony, etc. And the best is maybe there's like, say, 7 or 8 little strips of paper. Bob speaks 5 times or 4 times, and Tony speaks, I don't know, like 4 times or 5 times, something like that. Paste them around the room on the wall. So Bob's thing here, and then Tony and Bob and Tony. Space them out around your classroom. Then put students into pairs. So one person is the writer, the other person is the dictator. So the writer person sits at their desk with a pencil and a paper, and the dictator has to stand up. They go over to any paper. They're not in the precise order. I just mix them up randomly. So they go over to a paper. They read it to themselves silently. They try to memorize what's on that paper, and then they come back to their partner, the writer. They say it to their partner, and their partner has to write it down. If they can't get that whole sentence or that whole utterance in one go, they can go back and read that one again. It's no problem. And they just go around the classroom until they have, say, like the 8 statements on their paper. Once they do, the 2 people can sit down together and they can go through that and then put them into the correct order. So what's the first thing Bob said, and then Tony said this, and then Bob said that. And then once they're done, the students can put up their hand and I will quickly check. So I usually give a limit of how many errors they can have in their dictation, say like 3 errors or maybe even 1 for like very advanced level students, and then they have to get it into the correct order. If they've met both of those requirements, they're the winner. That's it. And I usually will go until a few more groups finish just to give them a chance to do that. And then in the end, I'll maybe have like the winning team read out their conversation just for people that didn't quite finish it. Yeah, so that's it. So that's one of my favorite 4 skills ESL activities. Try it out for yourself. And I have a ton of tips. There are some things that can go wrong in this activity. I've seen it happen. It's happened to me. So definitely check out my blog post for details on how to avoid the worst case scenario. All right, so if you like this video, please hit like, subscribe. I have a ton more activities and games coming. Here are my top 10 tips for teaching IELTS, TOEFL, TOEIC, or other English proficiency exams. The first tip to remember is that it's not your ultimate responsibility. It's the student's responsibility to get whatever score they need on the TOEFL or the IELTS in order to get into university, to get a job, or to do whatever they need to do in their lives. So you do your best to help the students, but don't take on that stress. It is the student's responsibility. The second tip is vocabulary is very important on these exams. Things like phrasal verbs, collocations, idioms, etc. So look up, say, the most common words on the IELTS exam or the most common words on the TOEFL exam, and then give students vocabulary tests to help them out with this. The third tip is to pay attention to timing. Students often don't have to read under pressure, and they often don't have to speak, say, for precisely 20 to 30 seconds. So help students out with the timing, give them an idea of what it feels like to speak for 30 seconds, or to read, say, 4 paragraphs in 1 minute or something like that. The fourth tip is to focus on structure. So some of these exams have very specific ways to answer questions, particularly in the speaking section. So give students some strategies and some tips on how to answer those questions correctly in the right format. The fifth tip is to give students lots of opportunities to do practice tests. So look them up online. You could even buy some books that have practice tests, and then spend time doing this in class. So students will get an idea of the timing, of how long it takes, and kind of an idea of what kinds of questions are on the exam. The sixth tip is to assign homework. So this could include vocabulary, it could include doing some like example speaking questions and then recording their answer and bringing them to class, whatever you're focusing on. Not all students will do the homework, but the students who are serious about getting a high score will, and it will really help them to get a better score on those exams. The seventh tip is to use a test prep book. So you can kind of do some random things off the internet and kind of design a few of your own little things, but really the best way to prepare a student for something like the IELTS or the TOEFL or the TOEIC is to use a specialized exam prep book. There are some good ones, some less good ones out there, so kind of ask around for some recommendations, check Google reviews and see what people are using, and then use an exam prep book, at least for homework and some of the time in your class as well. The eighth tip to prepare students for English proficiency exams is to have them record their answers. So if you're working on IELTS speaking, have students record their answers on their phones, and then they can review them later. You can also review them if they say do that at home for homework, and then you can review them when they come back to class. The ninth tip is to give feedback. So when students are doing, say, a speaking question, give them feedback on what went well, what went wrong, and what they could improve on. The 10th tip is to teach note-taking. So students can often, in their listening portions of the exam, or even in their reading portion, they can take notes. So teach students how to do this. Teach them how to only write down the key words and not full sentences, for example. Okay, so that is it for my top 10 tips for teaching IELTS, TOEFL, TOEIC, or other English proficiency exams. Here are my top 5 ESL small talk activities. Number 1 is 3 in a row. So I would put students into pairs, and then each pair matches up with another pair. So each group would have 4 students, 2 teams of 2. And then I would have a grid, a 5x5 grid, and I would write a bunch of topics on the board that people would kind of do for small talk. So like maybe getting to work, hobbies, weather, sports, weekend plans, all those things, kind of the latest TV shows, whatever. And then students would do paper, rock, scissors, and the winning team, they get to choose the first square. So maybe they would choose like hobbies. The other team would have their cell phone and they would do a timer for 1 minute. And the team that chose that hobbies square, their challenge is to talk about hobbies for 1 minute without stopping. If they're successful, they get to put an X on that square or an O, whatever that is. One team would be X, one team would be O. And the goal is to get 3 in a row. So after they're done, they put their X on there, and then the other team would choose a square, and they have to talk for 1 minute. All right, the second small talk activity is a cocktail party. So I try to replicate real life as much as possible in my classroom. So to kind of warm this activity up, I would get students to shout out some topics that people might talk about at a party. So maybe they would talk about their kids, they would talk about their weekends, maybe their upcoming holidays. Maybe they complain about the weather, they talk about the sports team, and then I would also get students to shout out some things that you shouldn't talk about. So for example, asking someone how old they are, talking about politics, religion, kind of like controversial like things like maybe like abortion, I don't know, whatever. You just want to avoid those controversial topics. So that's fresh in students' minds. And then I get students to kind of give me some examples of ways they would start a conversation. So they would shout out some examples, like for example, maybe do you have any weekend plans or do you have any holidays coming up, whatever. So that's also fresh in students' mind. And then I say, okay, we're going to practice. So all the students will stand up and then they can just mingle around the classroom, having little small talk conversations with everybody. And so I would also tell students that the goal is not to be stuck talking to someone for the entire 10 minutes or 15 minutes, however long we do this activity, but the goal is to mingle and kind of talk to everybody. So I'd also talk about ways to politely end a conversation. So I would say I encourage students to maybe talk to someone for maybe 2 minutes and then or 3 minutes and then move on and talk to someone else. So if I notice students are just stuck talking to the same person, I would just kind of tap them on their shoulder and I'd say, okay, go talk to someone else now, and kind of just give them a gentle reminder about that. All right, the third activity is the expert. So everyone likes talking about things that they know a lot about. So I get students on a piece of paper to write down 3 things that they are very knowledgeable in. So maybe it's like cooking Korean food, playing softball, and pro tennis, something like that, watching pro tennis. And then I get them to choose maybe the 1 or 2 topics that they think other people might be most interested in. After that, I put students into pairs and they would have their little paper with the 2 maybe topics that they think other people are most interested in circled. And then I get those 2 students to have a conversation for 4 or 5 minutes about the topics on their piece of paper. Once they're done that, I get them to switch and then they can talk to someone else. So this is a very nice introductory activity. The fourth small talk activity is telling a story. So people at parties or at work, whatever, love to tell stories. And it's a kind of a nice way to get to know someone and to share your personality. So I have a little story prompt. So for example, maybe your most embarrassing moment or a funny story from when you were in middle school or high school, something from when you were growing up, maybe your favorite holiday, whatever that is. And then I give students a little bit of time to prepare their story. So I don't want them to write sentence by sentence, but they can write a few little notes about the points that they're going to cover. Then I put students into groups of 4 and they would tell their story to the group. And so the first person is telling their story, the other 3 people are listening. And then at the end, those other 3 people have to ask a follow-up question. And then of course the person has to answer. Then the second person tells their story and then so on it goes. And the 5th small talk activity is to give students some conversation starters. So if you tell students, okay, do small talk with your partner for 5 minutes, I mean, you're probably going to have a lot of silence in your class because there just isn't really enough information or structure to that class. Instead, I like to give students some conversation starters. Of course, I encourage like kind of free-flowing conversation, follow-up questions, but then they also have those conversation starters if they get stuck. So I would have, for example, like upcoming holiday plans, or what did you do last weekend? What's your plan for tonight? What do you think about the weather? Do you follow the Edmonton Oilers or whoever your local sports team is? And that kind of thing. So that is it for my small talk activities for your ESL classroom. Here are my top 10 conversation starters for adults. So I hate talking about the same old boring things, and I'm an English teacher, and I hate having my students talk about these same boring things or me talking about the same boring things with them. So I like to have some good ideas for conversation starters. So my first one is, if you won the lottery, what would you do? And a nice fit with this, if you're a teacher, is to put this with the If I Had $1 Million song by the Bare Naked Ladies and make a whole lesson around this. The second thing I like to talk about is bucket list. So a bucket list item is something you want to do before you die. So I get students to think of maybe like 2 or 3 things that they want to do, and then we can talk about that. The third conversation topic is guilty pleasures. So this is something that you do that you know is bad. However, you do it anyway because it's your guilty pleasure. The fourth conversation starter is, what was the last thing you bought that cost more than a certain amount, say $100 or $500, and it would be lower if you're talking with kids. All right, the fifth thing is, if you were president or prime minister, what would you do and what would you change about your country? The next conversation starter is a dream vacation. So I love hearing the differences that people have. Some people would go to the beach, some people would go on like a backpacking trip. There's a million different things that people would choose. The next one is a bit morbid, but quite interesting to find out. It's, if you had 100 days left to live, how would you spend it? And who would you spend it with? The next one is, what is your favorite thing to cook? And everyone always has the most delicious things. It motivates me to go home and make something for myself. The next conversation starter is, what is your dream job? And if I'm talking to adults, I like to know if they're doing their dream job now or they have kind of another thing that they are more interested in. And then the last one is, what are your bad habits? So these are things that maybe people do, like they drink a lot or smoking, that kind of thing. I like to find out what that is. Okay, so those are my top 10 conversation starters. Please leave a comment and tell me, what is your favorite conversation starter? Here are my top 10 ESL teaching topics for adults. Number 1 is hobbies. The second one is food. Number 3 is what you do in your free time. The fourth one is current events, but be sure not to choose anything too controversial. The fifth one is stress. So it can be work stress, being busy, life stress, that kind of thing. Number 6 is bad habits like smoking, drinking, eating junk food. The next one is money. Number 7 is talking about dating and marriage, but be careful which countries you talk about that in. Number 9 is work life, or if you're teaching students, school life. And then number 10 is daily routines. So those are my top 10 ideas for teaching topics for adults. Please be sure to check out my book, 101 ESL Activities for Adults. I'll put the link up there. Please hit like, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.